The morning sun beat down on the faded pickup truck as it rumbled along Highway 10, its cracked windshield glittering with desert dust. Inside, Franklin Barrow, Frank to anyone who still remembered him, gripped the steering wheel with hands weathered by 65 years of Utah sun, wind, and toil. His eyes, sunken and sharp, flicked toward the county map folded on the passenger seat. A red circle marked his destination, the Emery County Courthouse. He hadn't set foot in that building in over a decade, not since the foreclosure notice came and they stripped his family farm away like it was a late bill someone forgot to pay. That land, once filled with neat rows of corn and his wife's laughter, had dried up during the drought and cracked like his future. His wife, Eleanor, had passed 5 years ago, and his son, Caleb, off somewhere in Texas chasing oil and staying just far enough away to keep from talking. All Frank had left was a rusty truck, a duffel bag of clothes, and $900 saved in a coffee can hidden under the floorboards of a trailer he no longer called home. The courthouse parking lot was mostly empty when he arrived. Frank killed the engine and sat still, listening to the groan of the wind as it whipped across the flat landscape. Sagebrush rolled like tumbleweeds in slow motion. In the distance, the mountains watched in silence. He stepped out into the heat with a purpose. His boots thudded across the pavement. A few passers-by gave him curious glances, mostly city folks, real estate speculators in clean denim and sunglasses, sipping iced coffee and chatting on Bluetooth earpieces. Frank ignored them. He wasn't here for business. He was here for a place to die right. Inside the courthouse, the air conditioning was turned too high. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A modest sign pointed toward the tax auction room, handwritten and taped onto a plastic stand. Emery County Surplus Land Auction, 10 a.m. He was early. That gave him time to find a chair in the back and watch. They filed in slowly. Investors, ranchers, a couple of women in smart suits with clipboards. No one seemed particularly eager. One man near the front grumbled about waste of time and damn parcels full of tumbleweeds. Frank crossed his arms and waited. At 10:07, Macy Graham stepped to the podium. She wore dark slacks and a forest green blouse that somehow looked both professional and ready for the desert. Her voice was crisp, but not unfriendly. She explained the rules, the terms, the conditions of sale. Final, as is, no refunds, no legal liability. Frank had met her once, briefly, when he'd come by the county office in Farron to update his old driver's license. She was the one who handed him the auction list 2 weeks ago with a quiet word of advice. Some of these places are more trouble than they're worth, Mr. Barrow, especially 317. Now, as she read through the list, Frank's heart thudded harder. One by one, properties were announced. Bidding paddles went up and down like a quiet storm. Parcels with water rights fetched $20,000, $30,000. One property near the Green River hit 60 before the hammer dropped. Then came the one he'd been waiting for. Next, Macy said, scanning the room, we have parcel 317B, 15 acres. Deed records show it as the former O'Neill Ranch, abandoned in 1990. Includes a house structure, barn, and outbuildings. No utilities. Access via County Road 11. Starting bid, $900. Silence. The room shifted uncomfortably. Someone near the window muttered, "That the cursed one?" Another man chuckled. "Yeah, the place with the crater behind the barn." Macy cleared her throat. "Do I hear 1,000? Frank raised his paddle, handcrafted from plywood with the number 9 painted on it in fading black. "Bidder number 9, $900. Do I hear 1,000? No movement. A woman with a pearl necklace whispered, "That's the place with the explosion, right? Back in '89? My uncle said he saw lights over the ridge for a week." Frank's heart pounded, but his face stayed still. Macy tried again. "Do I hear 1,000? Anyone?" Still nothing. The air buzzed with hesitation. Even the real estate guys seemed uninterested. Going once, going twice. Frank's hands were damp. This was it. If anyone raised a paddle now, he was done. It wasn't like he could go any higher. "Sold," Macy said, banging the small gavel. "To bidder number 9 for $900. A few heads turned. Whispers echoed in the corners of the room. Frank stood slowly, pocketing his paddle. Macy met him near the front table, expression unreadable. "Mr. Barrow," she said softly, folding the deed packet, "you understand the condition of the property? I read everything you gave me." "You should know," she said, lowering her voice. "Nobody's lived on that land since the incident. There was an explosion back there in '89. No official explanation. The government brushed it off. Locals didn't." "I'm not afraid of dirt," Frank replied. She hesitated. "It's more than just dirt. Some say the place changes people. The last guy who tried to fix it up didn't last a week. Left in the middle of the night, never came back." "Maybe I'll last 6 days," Frank said. He signed the deed with hands that didn't tremble. She slid the papers into a folder. "It's yours. No backing out now." "I wouldn't if I could." Outside, the heat slammed into him like a fist. He stood for a long moment under the flat blue sky, staring out at the horizon. The folder under his arm felt heavier than paper. It felt like a second chance, or maybe a mistake too big to survive. He didn't know what pulled him to that ranch, what stirred under the ground behind the barn, or why no one else dared touch it. But Frank Barrow, with nothing left to lose and nowhere else to go, was going home, to the desert, to the unknown, to Ranch 317. The first time Frank Barrow opened the creaking door to Ranch 317, a gust of dry wind swept through the warped frame and filled his lungs with a cocktail of sun-baked wood, mildew, and a hint of oil. An oddly familiar scent he couldn't quite place. The front room of the house was a hollowed shell of what once might have passed for a humble living space. The wallpaper peeled in strips like skin after a sunburn. The floorboards groaned under the weight of every step, and years of wind-blown grit coated every surface like the inside of a sandblaster. Frank dropped his army surplus duffel by the broken leg of what used to be a coffee table and rubbed his temples. It was late afternoon, and the last light was sliding in through the gaps of the boarded-up windows, drawing stripes across the dust hanging in the air. "Well," he muttered, "we're not here for luxury." He rolled up his sleeves and went to work. The plumbing was shot. The kitchen faucet wheezed but didn't produce even a spit. The toilet tank was cracked straight through. Rats, or something smaller and faster, had nested in the insulation above the stove. And behind the fridge, which had long since given up its function, a bloated cockroach the size of his thumb twitched and scurried off into a dark crevice. Frank didn't flinch. After decades of farm life, vermin and rot weren't strangers. They were just problems, waiting for a wrench and some time. He found a broom with only half its bristles and swept a pathway through the worst of the sand, coating the kitchen tile, then cleared a corner of the living room to set up his cot. The night fell fast and cold, the temperature dropping nearly 40 degrees by the time he lit the tiny propane lamp. Wrapped in 2 wool blankets, Frank sat cross-legged on the cot, slowly sipping from a thermos of instant coffee he'd made on his portable camp stove. He kept the .38 revolver he'd inherited from his father within reach. The desert had a way of waking old memories, and sometimes old enemies. Unable to sleep, he decided to poke around. He started with the master bedroom, a mostly empty space, save for a warped dresser and a busted armoire. As he tugged on one of the drawer handles, it came loose in his hand with a snap, revealing a small locked compartment in the back wall of the cabinet. The lock had rusted over, but with a screwdriver and a gentle nudge, the latch gave way. Inside was a single item, an old, oil-stained map folded into quarters, brittle at the edges. It smelled faintly of gasoline and sweat. Frank unfolded it carefully on the floor, weighting the corners with tools from his kit. The map wasn't of Utah, or at least not any modern version of it. The lines were hand-drawn, the roads unnamed. But he recognized the topography, jagged outlines of the San Rafael swell, the serpentine twist of the Green River to the east. And then there it was, scrawled in faded pencil, an X, not far behind the ranch house, precisely where the old cattle barn sat in its sunken footprint behind the property. Frank stared at the mark, something prickling at the base of his skull. He bundled the map back into his coat pocket and stepped out into the night. The moon hung low, casting everything in a pale silver. He walked the 100 yards to the barn, the silence so deep it rang in his ears. The barn was barely standing, half of the roof missing, and one of the sliding doors leaned on rusted hinges. Inside, it smelled of dry hay and dust-choked decay. He played his flashlight across the dirt floor and rusty equipment. In the back, behind an overturned plow and a collapsed feed bin, he noticed something strange. The rear wall looked newer than the rest, repaired with different nails, a straighter pattern of boards. And beneath his boots, he felt a subtle rise. The brick flooring near the rear corner had a slight bulge, as though the ground below had pushed upward. He knelt and tapped one of the bricks with a metal wrench. It rang oddly hollow. Just then, a sound broke the stillness. A soft, metallic groan, distant but distinct, like a hinge turning slowly, or a heavy door easing open. Frank stood stock still, holding his breath. The sound didn't come again. He scanned the barn. Nothing moved except a loose rope swaying from the rafters, catching the breeze. He backed away slowly, flashlight tight in his grip. Back at the house, sleep came in fits. Around 3 a.m., he bolted upright. A second noise, a clang like metal scraping metal, reverberated faintly through the walls. He sat in the dark, listening. Silence returned, but he knew what he'd heard. Something was beneath that barn. By morning, Frank had made his decision. He packed a small toolkit, his flashlight, a crowbar, and his .38 revolver. If the place was cursed, as Macy had warned, then he wanted to see what the devil had left behind. As the sun rose over the ridge, casting long fingers of light across the red sand and brittle shrubs, Frank made his way to the barn. He wasn't a man easily spooked, but something was stirring under his feet, and for the first time in years, he felt alive again. The first rays of dawn painted the Emery County horizon in shades of muted pink and dusty gold as Frank Barrow stood at the edge of the old cattle barn, his shovel in hand and his breath visible in the chill morning air. The desert was always coldest right before the sun asserted itself, and today the silence seemed thicker than usual, like the land itself was holding its breath. He stepped through the open frame of the barn, the boards creaking underfoot. The same corner he'd marked in his mind the night before, just behind the warped wooden beams and where the floor tiles bulged subtly, called to him again. It wasn't just a hunch, it was instinct, that same eerie pull he felt the moment he first saw this ranch. Frank set down the old army duffel he'd carried from the house. Inside were a crowbar, a hammer, a flathead screwdriver, a small pickaxe, and his worn leather gloves. He'd also thrown in a canteen of water and a sandwich he'd slapped together in the dark. The first few inches of digging came easy. The ground was dry and sandy, years of wind-blown soil gathered over the cracked tiles. But as he got deeper, closer to the strange rise in the floor, his shovel hit something with a dull, metallic thunk. Frank dropped to his knees, brushing away the dirt with his hands. There it was, a flat, circular panel of iron, nearly 3 feet across, flush with the earth around it, but ringed by a faint seam. It was aged, rust-fringed in spots, but intact. In its center was a small recessed plate, smooth, circular, and embedded with a dial. Not just any dial. A rotary lock, Frank muttered to himself, running a calloused finger over the dial's face, just like the ones they used in munitions storage. His memory drifted back 50 years, to his brief stint in the army. It had been a lifetime ago, and yet the muscle memory was still there. He remembered the base in Nevada, where similar reinforced hatches led to underground armories. This was built for longevity, for secrecy. Frank grabbed the crowbar and tapped around the edge of the hatch. Solid, no give. This thing had been buried for decades. But the dial, that was the key. He inspected the outer ring. Faint markings remained, worn down by time, numbers etched into the metal, barely legible. He leaned in closer. Then he saw it. Scratched into the plate, just above the dial, barely visible in the slanting light, were 3 numbers, 15479. A combination? He steadied the dial with his fingers. Slowly, deliberately, he rotated it left to 15, then right to 47, then back left to 9. Click. A deep mechanical sound echoed from below. It wasn't just the satisfying snap of a padlock. It was the unmistakable thud of steel mechanisms disengaging. The hatch trembled slightly, and then shifted, just enough for Frank to slip his fingers underneath. He grunted, heaved, and the round iron lid groaned open, releasing a puff of stale, cool air. The scent that emerged wasn't rot or decay. It was something else. Processed, filtered, almost sterile. What lay beneath made his breath catch. A circular shaft, just wide enough for a person to descend, lined with metal rungs that led into darkness. The walls were reinforced concrete, surprisingly clean. No dust, no cobwebs, just a faint shimmer on the surface, like condensation clinging to cold stone. Frank pulled his flashlight from the duffel and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a spiral of metal steps that disappeared into the shadows. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. For a long moment, he stood there, one hand on the rim of the hatch, the other holding the light, frozen between wonder and dread. Every instinct told him this wasn't just an old storm shelter or root cellar. This was something else, something forgotten, or maybe something deliberately hidden. The air drifting up was too clean for a decades-old bunker. There was no rot, no mold, not even the tang of rust. It smelled functional. "Still breathing," Frank murmured, like it never shut down. But he wasn't about to go in blind. He let the hatch rest open, then stepped back and closed it gently, marking the edges with a line of chalk from his bag. He'd need to prepare. Whatever was down there, it hadn't seen the light of day in a long time, and he wasn't about to meet it without some backup. Back in the house, Frank sat at the kitchen table, the faded oil map laid out before him, a cold cup of coffee trembling in his hand. His heart was still racing. He'd unlocked something buried in sand and silence. He could feel it. He pulled open the drawer near the sink and retrieved a small metal box. Inside, wrapped in a red cloth, was his old .38 revolver, cleaned but long unused. He checked the chamber. Full, 6 shots. He tucked it into his belt. From the hallway closet, he retrieved a dusty Coleman lantern, his old battery-powered headlamp, and a portable generator he used back when the farm had its own irrigation pump. He poured a half-gallon of fuel into the tank, pulled the cord. It sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. Still worked. He smiled grimly. He was going back down there. Not today, maybe. But soon. He'd uncover what was buried beneath ranch number 317. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. The wind howled across the desert flats like a restless spirit, rattling loose shutters and sending whispers through the cracks in the old ranch walls. Around midnight, he sat bolt upright in bed. There it was again. The same sound he'd heard the night before. A long, metallic groan, as if something heavy had shifted beneath the barn. It wasn't wind. It wasn't a coyote nosing around the feed trough. It was deeper, a vibration that seemed to pass through the floorboards and settle in his bones. He slipped out of bed, grabbed his flashlight, and padded barefoot across the cold wooden floor to the front door. Outside, the desert was quiet, moonlight bathing the sand and sagebrush in silver. But the barn stood like a dark sentinel against the horizon, and from its depths, Frank thought he saw the faintest flicker, like a light, deep below, had blinked once and gone out. He swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Tomorrow," he said under his breath. "Tomorrow, I go down." The desert wind had died down by the time Frank Barrow descended once more into the earth. His lantern cast long shadows across the concrete walls, dancing like ghosts on the surface of a world untouched by time. The narrow tunnel opened into a larger corridor, and for a moment, Frank simply stood there, breathing in the cold, sterile air. There was no scent of mold, no insect buzz, no decay. Just silence and concrete, as though the place had been sealed not for years, but for a moment. He stepped forward, boots thudding against the floor, echoing faintly in the distance. The light from his lantern flickered across a series of signs bolted to the wall, faded but legible. One read, "Authorized personnel only." Another, "Caution, high voltage." They were printed in the blocky, no-nonsense font of Cold War-era military installations. Frank turned into a side room, his breath caught, a laboratory, or what used to be one. There were workbenches pushed against the walls, covered in dust-coated tools, unlabeled glass vials, corroded clamps, and a microscope whose lens had long since fogged over. The walls were lined with file cabinets, rust blooming at their bases. A few fluorescent lights hung from the ceiling, dark and lifeless, their tubes shattered or missing. He swept his lantern toward the back of the room. A cot sat in the corner, thin mattress, wool blankets still folded atop it. A battered locker leaned open beside it, empty. The facility had housed someone, that much was clear. Whether they had left in a hurry or had been gone for decades, he couldn't tell. Moving slowly, Frank entered the next room. It was more industrial in nature, thicker walls, reinforced piping, and a set of large metal canisters stacked neatly against one wall. He recognized them immediately from his time as a young recruit decades ago, fuel containers, military grade. Several were still sealed. He reached out, brushed off the dust. A red warning label read, "Combustible, handle with care." Along the adjacent wall, a large electrical panel stood, wires running out in every direction like the veins of the place. Though the system was clearly inactive, it had been a serious operation once. This was no basement hobby lab. This was military infrastructure. Jesus, Frank muttered under his breath. What the hell were they doing down here? In a third room, he found what looked like an operations office. 2 desks, a map table, and a corkboard lined the space. On the table sat a collection of folders, a dusty typewriter, and a large, rolled-up document weighed down by a rusted paperweight. Frank approached the desk cautiously. His eyes scanned the surface, then landed on a thick file folder left open, a page yellowed with age sticking up at an angle. He brushed it clean. In large, bold letters across the top, the words stopped him cold. Meridian Project Proposal. Classified level. Top secret. His heart stuttered. He sat down slowly, the old chair creaking beneath him. His fingers turned the page gently, revealing a typewritten document full of engineering terms, geological survey codes, and something about strategic extraction modeling for rare earth elements. The diagrams showed a subterranean grid pattern stretching beneath large portions of southern Utah, marked with various mineral classifications: lithium, cesium, yttrium, elements Frank had only ever heard mentioned on the news in relation to high-tech batteries and satellite systems. Another diagram highlighted fault lines, possibly seismic impact zones. The deeper he read, the more disturbing the implications became. The lab he stood in hadn't been testing soil samples or recording rainfall. They were analyzing subterranean energy signatures. There were mentions of deep resonance field fluctuations, of tectonic discharge anomalies, of civilian masking protocols in the event of perimeter breach. Frank shook his head. What the hell is this? He leaned forward, pushing aside a stack of dusty notebooks, when something metallic caught his eye, a small square handle embedded in the wall just beneath the desk. Curious, he reached under and tugged. A panel popped open. Inside, tucked into a recessed wall compartment, was a safe. It was small, heavy-duty, and bore a dial lock, a rotary combination system that hadn't seen daylight in years. Dust and grit had collected around the seams, but the metal itself was solid. Frank ran his fingers across the edges. No keyholes, no digital interfaces. Old school. He sat back and stared at the thing, thinking. No one had mentioned anything about a safe in any of the documents above. There were no markings on it, no serial numbers. Whoever installed it had wanted it hidden. Badly. Next to the safe, still on the table, sat an old binder that had been flipped open to a folded map. Frank leaned in, frowning. It was a mineral survey, a detailed geological blueprint of the surrounding region, including the ranch. A red line traced through the land, curving beneath what was now Frank's back pasture. At the bottom right corner, handwritten in faded ink, was a single notation. Line 14 intersects Node 317. Active anomalies recorded. Do not disturb. Node 317. The same number as the ranch's listing at the auction. Frank swallowed hard, suddenly aware of just how deep this rabbit hole might go. He glanced back at the safe. Whatever was inside had been deliberately hidden, behind layers of paperwork, beneath government silence, buried in a concrete tomb in the middle of the desert. He made a quick decision. He wouldn't try to force it open, not yet. If he damaged it, he might lose whatever was inside forever. He needed tools, time, maybe even help. Though who in their right mind could he trust with this? Frank stuffed several pages from the Meridian file into his canvas bag, along with a few maps and a folder labeled Field Logs, July 89. Before leaving, he took one last look around the room. His eyes landed on a faded photograph pinned to the corkboard. It showed 3 men in military uniforms, standing in front of a nondescript metal building. He squinted at the small handwriting scrawled across the bottom. Meridian Field Team, 1989, last full rotation. Frank stared at the date. That was the year Macy Graham had mentioned, the year of the strange explosion no one ever explained, the year this place likely went dark. Shivering despite the heat of the day above, Frank climbed back up the metal stairs, the sound of his boots echoing up the shaft. As he emerged into the sunlight, blinking against the harsh brightness, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the dry, electric scent of storm far off over the horizon. He sealed the barn doors behind him and sat for a long time on the porch, the folder clutched in his lap. Something big had happened here, and whatever it was, it hadn't stayed buried forever. He looked out over the land, dusty, cracked, quiet. The same land he'd bought for $900. The same land someone else had once spent millions to hide something under. Frank Barrow wasn't a man who spooked easily, but as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the red sand and the forgotten barn, he couldn't help but feel a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Tomorrow, he'd return, and this time, he'd come with questions. Frank Barrow stood in the early morning light, holding a manila folder thick with photocopies and fragile originals. He hadn't slept. The documents he'd found in the underground facility haunted him like the echo of a long-forgotten voice. Project Meridian, top secret proposal. Wasn't just government jargon. It hinted at something much deeper, something buried not just in the desert, but in decades of silence and secrecy. By 7:30 a.m., Frank was already steering his battered Chevy pickup down the cracked, sun-baked road toward Emory's small sheriff's station. Dust trailed behind him like a ghost, clinging to his tailgate. Sheriff Tom Rourke had once been a beer-drinking buddy back in high school. Now, Tom was a man of protocol and suspicion, wearing his badge with an ever-present squint, like he was always waiting for someone to lie. Frank parked beside a squad car, took a breath, and walked inside. "Frank Barrow?" Tom said, standing up from behind his desk. "Haven't seen your stubborn hide in years. What brings you into town so early?" "Need a few minutes of your time, Tom." "It ain't a social call." Tom's eyes narrowed. "Well, that sounds promising. Have a seat." Frank handed over the folder. Tom opened it, casually flipping through a few pages before he froze at a page labeled Proposed Extraction Zones, Central Basin Quadrant. B. Meridian. The color drained from his sun-worn face. "Where did you get this?" Frank crossed his arms. "Found it on that old ranch I bought. Underground facility. Hidden like it was never meant to be found." Tom closed the folder slowly, his voice lower now. "Frank, this ain't the kind of thing you wave around town. That project, it was supposed to be buried in red sand with the rest of our sins back in '91. I figured you'd know something, so what the hell was it?" Tom leaned back in his chair and let out a long, dry sigh. "All I know is bits and rumors. Meridian was one of those black-budget projects. Experimental resource mapping, some kind of military-industrial thing. They shut it down fast. There was an explosion out by the buttes. Nobody ever said it was connected, but folks stopped asking questions." Frank felt the chill of validation creep up his spine. "You think it's dangerous?" "I think if it's what I suspect, there are people who won't want it unburied. You need to be careful, Frank. Don't go digging too deep unless you're ready to live with the weight." "You know someone who might be able to tell me more? Someone not behind a badge?" Tom hesitated, then scribbled a name and number on a yellow sticky note. "Dr. Lauren Vega, teaches geology and mineral science at the university. Worked on federal surveys a decade ago. If anyone can tell you whether what you found is real, it's her." Lauren Vega had piercing gray eyes and a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions in public forums. When Frank called her and mentioned old federal mining plans and classified coordinates, her tone shifted from skeptical to intrigued. "You have these documents with you?" she asked. "In person. I don't send that kind of thing through email." She agreed to meet at a cafe in the next town over. Neutral ground, less chance of being overheard. When Frank arrived, she was already seated, laptop open, wearing a forest green field jacket and tortoiseshell glasses. "Mr. Barrow," she said as he approached, "let's see what you brought." Frank slid the folder across the table. She opened it, expression shifting by the second. When she got to the mineral grid maps, her fingers froze. "This can't be real." "It is. Found it myself." "You ever hear of Meridian?" "Only in vague reference during my graduate work. It was a military research initiative buried under layers of need-to-know clearance. Nobody ever saw the full scope. Some thought it was an attempt to identify critical mineral deposits for defense manufacturing. Others believed it involved experimental energy tech. These documents..." She trailed off, flipping faster now. "This map here, Central Basin, that region's been surveyed 100 times, but never mapped this precisely. And the composition markers, if this is accurate, you're sitting on one of the richest rare earth mineral zones in the western United States. Maybe the world." Frank leaned in. "What kind of minerals are we talking about?" "Titanium, lithium, terbium, neodymium. These aren't just valuable, they're strategic, essential for military tech, satellites, electric grids. If Meridian found a sustainable cache of these, it explains everything." "Why it was buried." Lauren nodded, her voice hushed. "And why it stayed buried." That night, back at the ranch, Frank sat in his chair with the lights off. The desert wind howled against the cracked windows, whispering through the worn boards like it knew his name. He hadn't even noticed it at first, just a shape parked at the edge of the dirt road. A dark SUV. No lights, no movement, just idling like a shadow on four wheels. He killed the lamp, slid quietly across the room, and pulled back the curtain an inch. Still there. He didn't recognize the make, but it was black, polished, and unmarked. Frank stepped away from the window and walked to the gun cabinet. He hadn't opened it in years. The Remington shotgun was dusty, but clean. So were the shells. He didn't know who was watching, or what they wanted, but he knew this. They knew he was watching back, and he wasn't going anywhere. The morning sun had barely crested the red mesas when Frank Barrow heard the crunch of tires over dry gravel. He looked up from his workbench inside the barn, squinting through the dusty haze. A sleek black SUV, polished to a corporate sheen, rolled down the driveway and came to a smooth stop in front of the ranch house. It didn't belong to the sheriff, and it certainly wasn't a local. Frank wiped his hands on a rag, instinctively feeling for the wrench on his belt like it was a holstered revolver. The driver's door opened with a hush, and out stepped a tall, clean-shaven man in a gray sport coat and slacks that didn't belong within 100 miles of this kind of dust. His sunglasses glinted in the morning light. "Mr. Barrow," the man called, voice calm, smooth, confident. Frank said nothing at first. He studied the man's posture, the way he moved, polished, practiced, not a stranger to control. "That's me," Frank replied warily, approaching slowly. "And you are?" "Jameson Quaid," the man said, extending a hand. "I represent a real estate group focused on revitalizing underutilized properties in the Southwest. Thought I'd pay you a visit after hearing you acquired Ranch 317. Frank looked at the hand, then shook it briefly, noting the faint pressure behind the man's grip. Not too strong, not too weak. Calculated. "Can't say I've heard of your group," Frank muttered. "We work discreetly," Quaid replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're sitting on a lot of potential here, Mr. Barrow. Desert properties are gaining serious interest. Climate research, lithium extraction, solar arrays. All big-ticket ventures. We'd like to make you an offer." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You haven't seen the place yet?" "I've seen enough." Quaid reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. Inside was a typed offer letter and a certified cashier's check. $250,000, cash, no inspections, no delays. Frank blinked. The check shimmered like a hallucination. That amount was more than enough to buy a new house, pay off lingering debts, even retire in comfort. But it didn't sit right. It was too fast, too clean, and too much. He handed the folder back without opening it. "No thanks." Quaid looked momentarily surprised. "You might want to reconsider." "I've reconsidered already," Frank said, "and I still ain't selling." The silence between them was long and taut. Then Quaid chuckled and tucked the folder away. You've got backbone. I respect that. I'll be in touch. He tipped an imaginary hat and got back into the SUV. The vehicle rolled away, its glossy body swallowing the morning light. Frank watched it disappear into the heat shimmer. That night, unease settled over the ranch like dust. Frank installed a pair of trail cameras, cheap ones, the kind hunters used, but pointed toward the barn and the rear fence line. If Quaid or anyone else thought they could sneak back in, he'd be ready. Just after midnight, the camera by the barn triggered. Frank, awake in bed, received the ping on his phone. He opened the app and watched grainy footage. A human figure, tall and lean, ducked low behind the cattle pens. The infrared caught a brief glint of metal, a tool or perhaps a weapon, before the figure vanished around the side of the barn. Frank sat up, heart thumping. He grabbed his flashlight, loaded his old revolver, and stepped outside. The desert wind was still. No sound except the creak of the screen door and the crunch of his boots. He scanned the area, but whoever had been there was gone. The next morning, Frank reviewed the footage again. The intruder hadn't broken into the house or barn. He'd gone straight for the area behind the cattle shed, toward the hatch. Frank returned to the tunnel that afternoon, the hairs on his arms rising as he passed through the steel hatch. The flashlight beam sliced through the still air as he moved deeper underground, past the rooms he'd already explored. At the corridor's far end, behind a sliding metal panel, he discovered what appeared to be a reinforced doorway, a second access point with no handle, just a matte black plate beside it, recessed into the wall, a biometric scanner. Frank stepped closer, recognizing the model. It was military issue, fingerprint and retina. The panel lit up as he approached with a faint hum, then blinked red as it failed to read him. He tried again. Same result. Beneath the scanner, a faded stencil on the wall read, "Restricted access, classified level 7. Frank exhaled slowly. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep this part sealed. And yet, the scanner still worked, faintly glowing, still waiting for the right set of prints, the right pair of eyes. This wasn't just an abandoned lab. It was something more. And he was sure of one thing now. Jameson Quaid hadn't come for the view. Someone out there wanted what was down here, and they were willing to come in the dead of night to find it. Frank stepped back into the dark, the sound of his boots echoing as he made his way out of the chamber. He didn't know what lay beyond that sealed door, but he was done being a passive caretaker. If they were watching him, he'd start watching them back. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The air inside the underground corridor was cold and still, the kind of silence that pressed into your ears and made you question whether you were alone. Frank stood in front of the biometric scanner, the device's LED flickering red with a slow, pulsing refusal. He stared at it like a man confronting a locked door in a burning building, close enough to salvation, yet still shut out. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the sleeve of his shirt. "Damn thing's alive," he muttered, "but it sure as hell doesn't know who I am." Lauren knelt beside the scanner, her breath fogging slightly in the chilly air of the bunker. Her flashlight beam danced across the console's smooth surface as she pried open a side panel. "This tech is decades old, but it's no joke. The system's still drawing power, still scanning. It's not just locked, Frank. It's protecting something." Frank's voice was gruff, uncertain. "Any idea what kind of lock it is?" "Military-grade biometric," she replied. "You need the original user's biological markers to get through. It's not going to take a fingerprint from just anyone." He scratched the stubble on his chin, then snapped his fingers. "Wait, that cap I found, the one with the Air Force patch. It was in the upper storage box. Looked like it had seen action." Lauren's eyes lit up. "If there's hair in it, or even skin cells, we might be able to replicate the original user's ID signature." Frank didn't waste another second. He jogged back through the concrete halls, up the iron stairs, and into the old house. The wind outside howled through broken window panes and kicked dust across the wooden floor, but he barely noticed. He yanked open the trunk where he'd stashed the cap and carefully extracted it. The inside of the sweatband held a few short, grayish hairs. Back in the bunker, Lauren already had her portable sequencer laid out on a rolling cart she'd dragged in from the lab room. She took the cap with gloved hands, her movements slow, reverent. Let's see if this ghost wants to open a door for us. Minutes passed in tense silence as the sequencer analyzed the genetic material. Frank paced nearby, his boots echoing in the cavernous space. Finally, the device let out a soft chime. "Got it," Lauren said. "We've got a partial profile. Might be enough." She ran a cable from her sequencer to the biometric panel, fingers dancing across a small keypad. "I'm injecting the sequence. Now." A long pause, then the scanner blinked green. Frank exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Well, I'll be damned." The door creaked open slowly, steel hinges groaning like a leviathan waking from slumber. Beyond it was a chamber even colder than the one they stood in. The air smelled sterile, as if sealed away from time itself. They stepped inside. The room was vast, with steel shelving lining the walls, all meticulously labeled in codes Frank didn't understand. N, A, T, O designations, chemical symbols, radioactive warnings. Everything screamed classified. In the middle of the chamber stood a tarp-draped structure, bulky and humming faintly beneath the cover. Lauren pulled the tarp off with a sharp tug. Underneath was a piece of machinery like nothing Frank had ever seen. It was a tripod, but each leg ended in copper coils and sensor pods. At its center was a glass orb, emitting a low, steady pulse of green light. "Jesus," Lauren whispered. "This isn't just tech. It's decades ahead of its time." Frank stepped closer. "What does it do?" "I don't know exactly," she said, her voice trembling with awe. "But if I had to guess, advanced geomapping, deep resonance scanning, maybe even subatomic detection, and it's still active." Frank looked around the room. Stacked to the left were sealed cases labeled with strategic minerals, lithium, titanium, neodymium, materials critical to defense, aerospace, and cutting-edge electronics. "We're talking millions here," he murmured. Lauren shook her head slowly. "Not just millions. This isn't about money. This is about control. Whoever owns this tech owns access to the rarest resources on Earth. And that means leverage, geopolitical leverage." Frank's jaw clenched. The offer from Quaid made more sense now. "That bastard knew." Lauren turned to him, her voice low. "If Quaid knew, others do too. If you keep this, Frank, they'll come for it. All of them." Frank backed away from the glowing orb, his mind a storm of conflicted thoughts. For a man who'd lost everything, his farm, his family, his future, this should have been a miracle. Instead, it felt like a curse. "I'm not ready to lose this place," he said. "Not again." Lauren touched his shoulder gently. "Then we keep it quiet. For now, document everything. Keep our eyes open and be ready to run." They shut the door carefully behind them, re-engaging the lock. As they climbed back up into the fading light of the Utah desert, Frank paused at the top of the stairs. He turned and looked back into the shadows below. Something down there had been waiting for someone desperate enough, stubborn enough to uncover it. And now, that someone was him. Back in the farmhouse, Frank loaded his rifle and checked the locks one more time. He wasn't just defending a dusty ranch anymore. He was guarding a secret big enough to shake the country to its core. And somewhere out there, he knew, others were watching, waiting, and moving closer. The desert morning broke with an unusual stillness. A crimson sun crept slowly over the mesa, casting long shadows across the brittle grass and weather-beaten fencing that marked the edges of Frank Barrow's newly acquired land. He had barely touched his second cup of instant coffee when the sound of engines shattered the silence. Deep, guttural hums, not like ranch trucks or the occasional off-roaders who wandered too far from the highway, but heavier, more synchronized, military. Frank stepped out onto his porch, eyes narrowing against the sunlight. Dust plumes billowed in the distance, kicked up by a convoy of matte black vehicles approaching at an unnervingly deliberate pace. At least 4 Humvees, 1 larger SUV, and a pair of unmarked utility trucks bringing up the rear. He instinctively reached for the rifle just inside the doorframe, heart pounding, though he left it leaning against the wall. This wasn't a fight he could win with bullets. The lead SUV rolled to a slow halt in front of his house, and the doors popped open in unison. Out stepped a man in full military dress uniform, his posture straight as a rail. He looked to be in his 60s, his silver hair cropped with regulation precision, His boots shined so perfectly they glinted even in the dusty light. The name tag on his chest read, Harlan. "Mr. Barrow," he said without introduction, "I'm General Richard Harlan, United States Strategic Energy Command." Frank folded his arms. "This about my septic tank or something more serious?" Harlan didn't smile. "We need to have a conversation. Inside. Preferably off the record." Two soldiers stood back near the vehicles, watching the perimeter, while another pair approached Lauren's old Subaru, parked beside Frank's shed. Lauren, who had arrived earlier that morning to continue analyzing the samples they retrieved from the lower chamber, appeared in the doorway behind Frank. Harlan glanced at her, then turned back to Frank. "It would be in your best interest to comply voluntarily." Voluntarily? That some kind of polite threat? "Call it a federal courtesy," Harlan said, stepping past him into the living room like he already owned the place. Frank followed, fists clenched. The general took a moment to scan the room. His eyes passed over the scattered soil samples on the kitchen table, the blueprint of the underground facility Frank and Lauren had unrolled the night before, and the notebook opened to a page detailing trace rare earth signatures. "You've found it," Harlan said calmly. "Project Meridian." Lauren stepped forward. "You know what it is then?" "I know what it was, Doctor. Vega. A deep spectrum mineral research and extraction initiative classified under National Security Directive 117. Designed to identify subsurface resources capable of supporting next-generation defense technologies, superconductors, shielding alloys, directed energy platforms, all underground, all off the books." Frank let the words settle before speaking. "And you let it rot under the desert?" "It was mothballed after funding priorities shifted, but not forgotten. You, unfortunately, tripped the last remaining failsafes when you accessed the second chamber." "So now what? You planning to take it from me?" Harlan met his gaze squarely. "Let's not make this adversarial. What we need, Mr. Barrow, is your cooperation. Quiet cooperation." Frank remained silent. Outside, one of the soldiers radioed something into his headset. Lauren's phone buzzed with a warning. A GPS ping mismatch she had set up as a security trigger. The bunker was being accessed again. Harlan turned to one of his aides. "Take Dr. Vega to the mobile command unit for further debriefing. She'll be treated respectfully." Lauren stepped back. "What? I'm not going anywhere with you." Two MPs stepped in. Frank moved instinctively to block them, but Harlan raised a hand. "Mr. Barrow, don't make this harder than it has to be. She'll be released after the standard clearance review." "This is my land," Frank said through clenched teeth. "You don't get to walk in here and start hauling people off." Harlan's voice dropped to a level only Frank could hear. "That thing beneath your property isn't just about minerals. It's about leverage, energy independence, global control, the kind of strategic advantage that rewrites how wars are fought." Frank didn't respond. "You're sitting on a fault line of geopolitical power," Harlan said, his eyes hardening. "And right now, the smartest thing you can do is step back and let professionals handle it." Lauren was escorted out, visibly angry but silent. The convoy didn't leave, but rather settled into formation like a camp preparing for a longer stay. Harlan turned at the doorway just before exiting. "This discovery has implications far beyond your fence line, Mr. Barrow. You may own the dirt, but you don't own the future hidden beneath it. Think about that." Then, with a voice like a whisper of thunder, he added, "It's not just about resources anymore. It's about rewriting the rules of energy itself." And with that, he stepped into the sunlight, leaving Frank alone with a silence that rang louder than the departing engines. The sun had barely crested over the desert horizon when Frank woke with a start. The air inside the ranch house was unusually quiet, too quiet. A tension lingered in the walls, like static before a storm. As he shuffled into the kitchen to make coffee, something on the shelf caught his eye, a small glint from behind a dusty jar. Curious, he reached behind it and pulled out a small black object. At first glance, it looked like an old key fob. But when he turned it over, a red light blinked once before going dark. His heart stopped. A listening device. Frank stared at it in disbelief. Someone had planted this in his home. Not recently. The layer of dust meant it had been here for weeks, maybe months. He glanced around, paranoia setting in. What else had he missed? Who had been listening? He raced to the living room, now scanning everything with a different lens. Under a lamp base, behind a photo frame, inside a hollowed-out outlet. Another one. Then a third, tucked beneath the old armchair cushion. Frank grabbed a screwdriver and pried the last device open. The circuit board had an ID chip he didn't recognize, but the solder work was commercial grade. This wasn't the military, it was corporate. He called Lauren, who had just returned from federal detainment. "They let me go," she said wearily, "but they made it clear I'm still being watched. They confiscated my phone and warned me about leaking anything." "You were right," Frank said. "We're in the middle of something a lot bigger than just a hidden lab. Someone bugged my house." Lauren fell silent. Then, in a hushed tone, she said, "I need to see you." Now. They met in the barn an hour later. Frank showed her the listening devices. Lauren looked them over, her face tightening. "These are custom surveillance units, not military issued. They're used in private intelligence contracts, usually by resource companies that don't want competition." "And I think I know who planted them," Frank said grimly. He pulled out a still image from the motion camera he'd set up by the back entrance to the underground lab. It showed a figure in a dark jacket entering the barn under cover of night. Though blurry, the silhouette was unmistakable. "Jimmy Quaid." Lauren swore under her breath. "That bastard. I knew there was something off about him." Frank nodded. "He wasn't here to buy the ranch. He was gathering intel. He had access before I even knew the place existed." Lauren's voice dropped. "He works with a resource consortium based out of Macau. They've been linked to front companies acting on behalf of Chinese interests. If he's here, it's because he knows exactly what this place is sitting on." Frank leaned against a beam, trying to calm the surge of anger building in his chest. "So, what do we do? Sit around until one of these groups decides to disappear us?" "No," Lauren said. "We go public." Frank blinked. "You mean leak this?" "Yes, to someone we can trust, not the big outlets. They'll get bought off or flagged by federal eyes. I know someone. Elise Navarro, independent investigative journalist. She broke the Timber Point uranium scandal 2 years ago. If anyone can handle this, it's her." Frank hesitated. Going public would mean inviting scrutiny, putting Emma and everything he had left on the line. But the thought of doing nothing was worse. "Do it," he said. "Set up a meeting. But we stay offline. Nothing traceable." Lauren nodded and made the call from a burner phone. Navarro agreed to meet them the next night in a remote diner off Highway 191. That evening, as the sun dipped and bathed the red rock in golden light, the power in the ranch cut off without warning. Frank was in the kitchen when the refrigerator clicked off and the lights dimmed into darkness. "Lauren," he called. She rushed in from the study. "My laptop just shut down." Frank dashed to the barn and threw open the breaker box. All switches were still in place. He sprinted to the generator they'd recently installed and found it cold, fully fueled but disabled. A small device was clamped to the ignition system. He ripped it off and saw a blinking red light, another signal disruptor. "They shut us down," he muttered. Lauren joined him, flashlight in hand. "What about the facility?" They rushed through the barn, entered the hatch, and descended the stairs. When Frank reached the main terminal in the outer room, the touchscreen was dead. Emergency lights flickered once and faded. "EMP signal," Lauren said. "Localized, targeted just at our systems. Whoever did this didn't want to destroy everything. They just wanted to lock us out." Frank turned slowly. "They know we're trying to talk. They know we're close." Lauren nodded. "And they're scared. That's why they're moving fast. But they made a mistake." "What's that?" "They just confirmed everything we suspected." Frank exhaled, steadying himself. The stakes had just risen, but the line was drawn. He was no longer just an old man protecting a piece of land. He was a target, standing at the center of a battle no one else saw coming. And he was done being quiet. Frank lay motionless on the battered cot in his study, a damp cloth on his forehead and a shaky hand clutching his side, as if stricken by sudden pain. He winced theatrically as Lauren leaned over him, voice low and urgent. "Are you sure about this? Once we go in, there's no turning back." Frank nodded, his face pale beneath the flickering lamp. "They think I'm a broken old man. Let them. It buys us time. Get to the vault. Send the signal." Lauren didn't hesitate. She crossed the creaking floor and disappeared through the hidden cellar door. Moments later, Noah Briggs, the investigative journalist they'd contacted in secret, slipped through the side entrance of the ranch house. Dressed in field gear, a small satellite transmitter case slung over his shoulder, he gave Frank a quick nod. "You're sure the ventilation system is off? I can't risk a trace." "It's dead," Frank croaked. "They shut it down 2 nights ago. That's our opening. Go." Lauren and Noah descended into the darkened passage, their footsteps light but determined. Below the surface, the hulk of the old military installation loomed ahead, still intact but offline. They moved quickly, navigating by flashlight through the familiar corridors to the main control room. "Here," Lauren said, pointing to a secondary interface panel she had studied during previous visits. "They didn't rip this one out. It was redundant, off the grid. I can power it using our field rig." Noah nodded, setting up his transmitter, a portable satellite uplink unit capable of bouncing encrypted data to a network of independent newsrooms and environmental watch groups. The goal was simple: go public before Harlan could suppress everything. Within minutes, Lauren had rigged the panel to draw power from a portable generator. The screen blinked to life with a low hum. Noah plugged in a hard drive containing copies of all the documents, scans, and video evidence Frank and Lauren had accumulated, including the files tied to Project Meridian. "Transmitting now," Noah whispered, watching as the data streamed upward into the sky, relayed by the satellite dish hidden in his van a half-mile from the property. Back on the surface, Frank sat up slowly as the rumble of engines reached his ears. Dust curled in the air outside. Through the cracked window, he saw the convoy approaching. Black SUVs, desert-tan trucks, and an armored Humvee leading the way. Harlan had arrived. Frank grabbed the radio on the nightstand, switched to a private frequency, and spoke into it. "Lauren, company." "We're almost done," came her reply. Moments later, boots hit the gravel outside. The front door burst open. Tension rippled through the air as soldiers fanned out into the house. General Harlan stepped into the study, flanked by 2 agents. "Mr. Barrow," Harlan said coolly, "I hear you're unwell." Frank coughed weakly. "Might just be age catching up. Or maybe it's the smell of government lies. Hard to tell anymore." Harlan didn't rise to the bait. "We have intel suggesting unauthorized access to a decommissioned facility. I need to know where your guests are." "Probably halfway to the moon by now," Frank said with a half-smile. Harlan's jaw tightened. He turned to one of his men. "Sweep the cellar." But it was too late. At that exact moment, millions of devices across the country lit up with a breaking news alert. Screens flickered in living rooms, airports, and congressional offices. A video began to play, a grainy feed from a helmet camera showing the underground facility, the classified mineral caches, and the Project Meridian dossier stamped "Top Secret." Noah had timed it perfectly. The leak was live. Inside the ranch house, one of the soldiers received a radio call. He glanced at Harlan, then handed over his headset. "Sir, we have a problem. It's everywhere. CNN, Reuters, ProPublica, they're running the footage." For the first time, Harlan looked uncertain. "Who authorized this? How did they get it?" Frank stood now, wiping the fake sweat from his brow. "Sometimes, General, the truth digs itself out." Lauren and Noah emerged from the cellar moments later, escorted by soldiers who had been too slow to stop the upload. Noah raised his hands peacefully, but Lauren's eyes locked on Harlan with quiet fury. "You detained me under false pretenses," she said, "and now the world knows why." Harlan signaled to his men. "Take them into custody, all of them. We need containment, damage control." Frank didn't resist as his hands were cuffed behind his back. He was led outside into the blinding daylight, past rows of armed personnel who no longer met his gaze. The press hadn't arrived yet, but the echo of outrage already rang across the airwaves. Commentators demanded answers. Lawmakers called emergency sessions. Citizens flooded social media with hashtags like #MeridianExpose and #DesertTruth. As Frank was loaded into a transport van, he looked back at the ranch, his dusty, broken piece of land that had become ground zero for a national awakening. and he smiled. He may have been in cuffs, but the truth was finally free. The marble halls of Capitol Hill echoed with voices and hurried footsteps. A storm had broken in Washington, and it wasn't the kind that weather satellites could track. The footage Lauren Vega and investigative journalist Cole Reyes had released now played on every news station across the country. Americans had watched in disbelief as the secret military facility beneath a derelict Utah ranch came to light. Within 48 hours, the Senate Committee on Defense Oversight called for a public hearing. Lauren stood outside the hearing chamber in a modest blazer, clutching a manila folder of annotated documents and photos. Despite the calm she projected, her palms were damp. A congressional staffer opened the heavy wooden doors and beckoned her inside. Cameras clicked and murmurs rippled across the room as she took her seat at the witness table. Across from her sat a panel of senators, each framed by the American flag and their own reputations to protect. C-SPAN cameras rolled and the nation watched. Dr. Vega, Senator Collins of Vermont began, his voice sharp but composed. You were the first civilian expert to access the facility beneath what is now called the Barrow Ranch. Can you confirm the footage released to the press is authentic? Yes, Senator, Lauren replied. Every frame is unaltered. The facility existed beneath the ranch. It was operational, well-equipped, and clearly maintained military functions long after its decommissioning. And you believe it was part of a classified resource extraction initiative? I do. Based on the documents recovered, some of which are in your possession today, Project Meridian was a covert program using geological data for defense applications, but it evolved into unsanctioned mining of critical minerals. The room stirred. Meanwhile, Frank sat in a waiting room a few floors below, having been released that morning after 3 days of federal questioning. He wore his only clean shirt, ironed by a kind clerk in the Justice Department, and watched the hearing on a mounted TV. He wasn't a man of politics, but the words being spoken upstairs would shape the rest of his life. Lauren's testimony ran for over 2 hours. She outlined the facility's structure, the rare earth minerals stored in NATO-marked containers, and the presence of an advanced, unregistered geologic survey device. Senators questioned her credentials, motives, and affiliations. She answered each with the calm of a scientist who had nothing to hide. When the topic turned to Quaid, the mood shifted. Dr. Vega, Senator Thompson leaned in, do you believe Jameson Quaid was acting on behalf of a foreign government? There is strong evidence to suggest he was a resource broker for foreign entities, including China, she said, choosing her words carefully. His actions were calculated. He knew what lay beneath that land before Frank Barrow ever set foot on it. The name Frank Barrow drew murmurs. Later in the session, he was formally invited to speak. When Frank entered the chamber, a standing ovation met him. The image of an old farmer caught between global powers had captured America's imagination. Here was a man who had bought a forsaken ranch for $900, only to uncover secrets the government had buried. He stood humbly before the microphone. I'm not here to talk science or law, he began. I'm just a man who wanted peace and dirt under his boots. What I found under that dirt scared me. Not just the machines or the tunnels, but how fast, powerful men showed up, expecting silence. He paused, his voice steady. I didn't ask for this, but I won't run from it either. You can't keep secrets like this from the American people, not in a free country. It was the moment the hearing turned. News outlets replayed it for days. By the end of the week, Jameson Quaid was arrested and charged with espionage, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The Department of Defense issued a public acknowledgement of Project Meridian, followed by a formal declassification order. Documents were handed over to the National Archives and a newly established Scientific Oversight Committee. Frank's Ranch, no longer a secret military site, was placed under the stewardship of a private foundation, the Civilian Scientific Trust for Strategic Resources. The facility beneath the barn would be preserved as a research outpost, with oversight from both civilian scientists and a transparent advisory board. Days after the hearing, Frank received a letter. Embossed on the top was the seal of the National Institute for Strategic Resource Studies. It offered him a position as honorary advisor. He chuckled, rereading the letter under the porch light. Honorary advisor, he muttered. Ain't that something? He folded the letter carefully, looked out across the open land, and whispered, Well, Maureen, looks like the last chapter ain't been written yet. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the hills of Utah, the wind stirred softly through the sagebrush, carrying the weight of old secrets into a future now laid bare. The wind carried the dry scent of sagebrush and iron-rich soil as it swept across the wide red plains of Emery County. The old ranch house, once brittle and sagging beneath the weight of abandonment, now stood tall again, its windows gleaming with new glass, its paint fresh against the desert sun. Solar panels lined the roof. Raised garden beds stretched across the land where weeds once reigned. And at the heart of it all was Frank Barrow. It had been 6 months since the congressional hearings, since the world learned the truth about the Meridian Project and the forgotten treasures buried beneath the Utah sand. The underground facility, now overseen by the National Institute of Civil Science, was open to accredited researchers, but the land itself had been entrusted back to Frank. And Frank had a vision. The Barrow Research Farm, as it was now called, was no ordinary plot of reclaimed desert. Frank had partnered with soil scientists, environmental engineers, and agricultural technologists to explore how arid soil, infused with rare minerals and untouched geological formations, could become a laboratory for the future of farming. Tents and modular labs dotted the outskirts of the property, and the barn had been converted into a greenhouse hybrid. Cabbage and barley bloomed in soil that once cracked under the sun. Visitors from universities in Colorado and California came weekly. Journalists asked for interviews. Drones flew overhead, capturing time-lapse footage of crops growing where nothing should. But Frank, always a man of few words, kept his boots muddy and his head low. One afternoon, as Frank walked along the irrigation ditch he'd repaired with his own hands, he spotted a familiar truck rattling up the gravel path. Dust curled behind it like a ribbon. The door opened before it came to a full stop, and out stepped Caleb. Father and son looked at each other for a long moment, time measuring itself in the space between them. "Place looks good, Dad," Caleb finally said, kicking at the dirt. Frank nodded. "Better than it did when I bought it for $900. A beat passed, then a chuckle, then something else. Forgiveness, maybe, or the memory of what once was. "I saw the interviews," Caleb said. "The quiet hero of Utah. That's what the Times called you." "They don't know half the story," Frank replied, his voice gravel but warm. They walked side by side down toward the barn, passing rows of desert-adapted crops that should not have been thriving, but were. Caleb stopped at a sign near the entrance, Barrow Vega Agricultural Initiative. "Lauren's idea?" he asked. Frank nodded. "Ours, really. She pushed me into it, said this land has a second life, and so should we." Inside, Lauren was adjusting a nutrient dispersion monitor, her sleeves rolled up, hair pinned back. She glanced up and smiled as the two Barrows entered. "So, this is the mysterious Caleb," she said, wiping her hands on a rag. "You're just in time. We're testing vertical grow lamps in the East Corridor." Caleb blinked, then laughed. "You sound more excited about this than a mission to Mars." Lauren winked. "That's because this is a mission to Mars, metaphorically speaking. If we can make this soil work, it changes everything about food systems in arid regions." Frank stood silently watching them. He had built this place from dry bones. With grief still in his chest and ghosts in the walls, he had turned sorrow into something that could feed the world. Weeks passed, then months. The ranch thrived. Local school children visited for science tours. NASA sent a delegation to study the microstructure of the subsoil. Even representatives from the United Nations paid a visit, citing the Barrow Vega methods in sustainability briefings. One quiet evening, as the sky turned copper and gold and the coyotes sang low in the distance, Frank sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee. He watched Caleb haul a wheelbarrow full of compost, while Lauren recorded readings from the wind turbines. It was peaceful, not the silence of loneliness, but the hush of something hard-earned. Frank took off his hat and wiped his brow, looking out at the endless stretch of desert that now pulsed with life. The land no longer seemed like a burden. It had become a legacy. He murmured to no one, or perhaps to the wind. $900 to buy back a whole damn destiny. The sun dipped lower, painting the ranch in firelight. The desert, quiet, old, and listening, seemed to nod in agreement. And this time, Frank Barrow smiled. In the end, Frank Barrow didn't just uncover a secret buried beneath the Utah desert. He unearthed something far rarer, the power of one quiet life to shift the course of a nation. What began as an old man's last attempt to reclaim a forgotten farm became a catalyst for truth, for science, and for justice. He didn't ask for headlines. He didn't chase glory. But when the world looked the other way, Frank stood his ground, and in doing so, reminded us all that dignity doesn't come from power or wealth. It comes from knowing what's right, and doing it, even when you're scared, even when you're alone. He could have sold out. He could have walked away, but he didn't. Because some land isn't just dirt, it's memory, it's history. It's the kind of ground that grows more than crops. It grows character. And in a world so often shaped by loud voices and fast deals, maybe what we need most is someone like Frank Barrow, someone who listens to the silence, who digs, who stays. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that truth still matters, and that even the most overlooked among us can change everything, leave us a comment below. Tell us what part hit you the hardest. Or maybe just drop a "Thank you, Frank. He earned it." And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We've got more stories just like this. True tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the most unexpected corners of America. Folks who stand between silence and truth, between the past and a better future. We've seen desert secrets, buried vaults, Cold War echoes, and we're just getting started. So, hit that bell, subscribe, and share this with someone who still believes in courage, the quiet kind. Because out here, in the wide open, the truth doesn't whisper, it echoes, and we'll be here, telling the stories no one else will.